going to start with something that is indicative that, how should we put it, something's afoot. You look around these different areas that all connect, and you see that something is afoot. So we're talking Iran, we're talking the trade war now with China, we're talking the protests in Hong Kong, which clearly have United States input. We're talking about getting rid of missile treaties like the one with Russia to kick off an arms race. Of course, the deleting of the nuclear deal with Iran has kicked off the sequence that we're now seeing continuing. And if you want a thread which connects all of these things, then look no further than the far right extremist government in Israel. You know, I've talked a lot over the years about the Project for the New American Century in the United States. This was an organization created by ultra-Zionist Israel firsters in America. People like William Crystal and Robert Kagan were the co-founders. And they produced a document in September 2000 listing a series of countries they wanted to regime change. And 1 year after that document was published came 9/11, a 9/11 which fitted the bill perfectly for something that document said in September 2000, which is, if we're going to basically manipulate the American people to accept using the American military to regime change all these countries in the Middle East and elsewhere that we want, then we're going to have some kind of event to justify it. And what they said they needed in September 2000 was a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year to the month after they published that document, the United States had what President Bush at the time called the Pearl Harbor of the 21st century. And in my new book, brackets, utterly explosive, called The Trigger, which is very close to coming out now. It's available for pre-order on davidicke.com, and if it's pre-ordered, you'll get it before publication date. I'm going to blow apart 9/11. What was really behind it, and who was really behind it, and who really carried it out. And so you look at that list of countries that the Project for the New American Century listed for regime change, and it reads like a history of the period from 9/11 to now. It's Iraq, it's Libya, it's Syria, it's Iran, it's North Korea, it's Lebanon, leading to regime change eventually they demanded in China. And then you look at what's happened since, and you see that it's all unfolding as that document produced by a ultra-Zionist organization demanded. And it's no surprise, therefore, that the far-right extremist Israeli government under Netanyahu, but it wasn't him, it would still be going on, has been using its military to try to create unrest and conflict in this Middle East area because they want a war with Iran. All this stuff about we must stop Iran and Iran this, Iran that, Iran the other, it's all coming out of Israel because Israel owns Trump and certainly owns the people around Trump, like John Bolton, his national security advisor, who actually should be in jail for war crimes like most of the people in that job in recent times. John Bolton is owned by Sheldon Adelson, an ultra-Zionist billionaire and a casino owner in Las Vegas and media owner in Israel. And Adelson just happens to be Trump's biggest funder. And it was Adelson who drove the policy of deleting the nuclear deal with Iran, which had calmed everything down, because he doesn't want to calm everything down. And Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister and tyrant, has claimed that on tape that he didn't realize was being taped, that it was him, he said, actually his owner, Adelson, who persuaded Trump, persuaded in quotes, to drop the nuclear agreement with Iran. So there is pushback around the world against a war with Iran, but Israel ain't letting go, just as they're not letting go in Syria. Their plan to unseat Assad has been thwarted by Russia, but they're not letting go. They're still trying to keep that bubbling. That's why when Trump says, well, I'm going to move troops out of Syria, the Israeli-controlled cabal around him says, no, you're not. Same in Afghanistan. Because the idea is that American young men and women in the American military be used to advance Israel's agenda, not just in the Middle East, but further afield around the world. And that's why the Project for the New American Century published that document in September 2000 and talked about the new American century. Project for the new American century. No, it's Project for the new Israel century, using young men and women in the American military. That's the truth. But people are terrified of saying so. Well, sod that. That's what's happening. Why should we be frightened of speaking the truth? Because we might be called anti-Semitic. Oh, I'm terrified. Anti-Semitic, of course, being not only a misnomer, because it really means anti-Arab, but it's a scam, not to protect Jewish people from discrimination, but to protect Israel and Israel's far-right extremist government from legitimate criticism and exposure. Well, they can throw what they like at me. This mouth will not be silenced through intimidation, because it's vital for the nature of human society and where it goes and the world that our children and grandchildren live in, that this be known. So it's no surprise then that we see a series of stories this week like this. Lebanon, Iraq, Iran call out Israel's declaration of war, quote, after Israel bombs 3 countries in one weekend. Now, in my talks around the country, indeed around the world, clips of which are featured in the movie Renegade, I say to people in those talks, this is going back, I don't know, best part of a year, watch for Iran because they want a war with Iran. Watch for that kicking off. It's kicked off. And then I've also said, watch for Lebanon being pulled into this, because Lebanon was also on the list for regime change and takeover, that's what it means really, of the Project the American Century, this ultra-Zionist Israeli-owned organization. That, by the way, included among its number Dick Cheney, who was the de facto president, officially vice president, in the Bush regime that was peopled and controlled by the same cabal that ran the Project for the American Century. This is why all these things kicked off, and in successive regimes, whether Democrat or Republican, whether Labour or Conservative in Britain, this list of countries that this Israeli front organization, because that's what it was, is, well, I say is, officially, Project for the American Century has been disbanded, but it's just been replaced by others doing the same thing. They realized that the reason they disbanded it is because the alternative media so exposed its game that they needed to find another name to hide behind, because the Project for the American Century had become so discredited. Same thing, though, going on now under different names. And so the story goes, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran have declared recent Israeli aggression as an act of war after attacks on Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq over the weekend, promising devastating retaliation if the violence continues. Basically, what has been happening, not just this week, but ongoing, is that this country of 8 million people on this sliver of land in the Middle East has been sending out its state-of-the-art military to bomb targets in the Middle East, in these countries. Now, imagine if Iran did that, or anyone else did that. Well, anyone except Saudi Arabia, of course, because they're bombing the crap out of the people of Yemen with American and British and European support. Imagine if Iran was doing that. But Israel does what it bloody likes. Now, could I just ask the world to take a breath, there you go, and ask themselves why it is that a country of 8 million people, smaller than the population of London, gets away with military attacks on other countries that almost any other country outside the US, British, Saudi alliance would have enormous consequences for. Why is it? What power do they have that terrifies people from calling them out? Well, read the trigger and you'll find out. So the story goes on. A pair of kamikaze drone attacks on Beirut's southern suburbs on Sunday and a drone attack on Palestinian militia in the Bekaa Valley early on Monday morning were akin to a declaration of war, Lebanese President Michal Aoun told the United Nations Special Coordinator, adding that the aggression allows us to resort to our right to defending our sovereignty. But you see, when you defend your sovereignty from attacks by Israel, you are then an aggressor who must be dealt with. And Trump stands up and condemns you. It's absolutely disgusting what's going on. And they get away with it because they're a law unto themselves, because They are a law unto themselves, which is why I asked the question, how come they are a law unto themselves? What is this power they have? Which means they can do, as a tiny country, what others would never get away with. Much bigger ones would never get away with. Another story this week. Here's a question. You've got Israel, the Israeli government, the Israeli military, the Israeli intelligence network like Mossad, and they have one of the best equipped militaries in the world, including a considerable nuclear weapons program, nuclear weapons arsenal, which everyone knows they have, but they won't say if they have. And America and Israel actually has an official agreement, which is basically called Don't Ask, Don't Say, in which Israel does not say if they've got nuclear weapons that everyone knows they've got, and America won't ask. Another question. What is the power that Israel has over the United States that should happen? Name another country that has nuclear weapons that America has an agreement with that they won't ask if they have nuclear weapons and the other side doesn't say. None. So what is the power that this sliver of a country has over the United States government that it has that agreement, no one else does? These are questions that the anti-Semitism industry and protection racket is there to stop being asked. That'll be the bloody day. Anyway, here's another story. Israel preparing to bomb Houthis in Yemen to warn them away from Iran. Israel is planning to bomb Houthi and Hezbollah targets in Yemen to keep them from receiving weapons from Iran following several Israeli attacks on Iraqi targets, Kuwaiti media has reported. Another thing that's answered in the trigger, by the way, is why Saudi Arabia and Israel are so close. You would think that the so-called spiritual center of Islam in Saudi Arabia, Mecca, Medina, and the Israeli government would be at loggerheads. But no, they're very close. Much closer in private than even they are in public, although they're becoming more close in public. Why is that? Well, the trigger answers that. Another one. Netanyahu claims Israel's Syrian strikes thwarted imminent Iranian aggression. Nonsense. The Israeli Defense Forces, the story says, have struck multiple Iranian targets outside Damascus, claiming it helped prevent a deadly attack by killer drones. Okay, so what's your evidence? Well, we've said so. Okay, gotcha, that's proof, gotcha, right? There were multiple reports of explosions in the sky over Damascus as Syrian air defense forces engaged, quote, hostile targets coming from the direction of the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Illegally occupied by Israel, Golan Heights, which is an occupation that's been recognized as legitimate, that Golan is actually part now of Israel. It is been accepted by Donald Trump, who's owned by Israel. In a rare admission, the Israeli IDF confirmed the raid, claiming that it targeted Iranian forces and Shiite militias who were allegedly planning a large-scale attack of multiple killer drones. The raid reportedly focused around a village in the southeast of Damascus, but the majority of the missiles were intercepted before they could reach their targets. Where's the condemnation? From the moral West? Nowhere. Another story. 2 Israeli suicide drones crash and explode in Beirut, Lebanon's Hezbollah claims. An explosion rocked the Lebanese capital just as Israel was bombing Iranian targets in Syria. The blast was the result of an Israeli drone attack in which a UAV crashed and another prematurely exploded, Hezbollah claims. A small drone failed to detonate and crashed in the southern suburb of Beirut, while a second drone exploded near the militant group's media center, damaging the building. No casualties were reported from the incidents. So what we're seeing now, when I say something's afoot, is a pattern of aggression by Israel, which is designed to kick off conflict in the Middle East, not least with Iran and Lebanon, both on the list of the Project for the New American Century, which is an Israeli document. And you know what we've seen in recent times is Trump being presented as anti-Semitic, and he's come out and said that if any Jewish people in America that support the Democrats are being disloyal, and it's being presented as if, well, you know, when the congresswomen like Ilhan Omar were banned from visiting Israel, it was presented in the media that Trump had said something on his Twitter account. I mean, don't tell me it's not true, but it is. And Israel had responded to that. And that was presented as, oh, Israel's told what to do by Trump and America, when the absolute opposite is the case. And this presentation, the way these things are being presented, is simply to hide the fact as best as they can that Trump is owned by Israel and those that own Israel. Because this is not in the end about Jewish people. This is about the cabal that own Israel, who are very, very different from Jewish people. It's a long story, but I tell it in the trigger. Jewish leaders outraged by Trump saying Jews disloyal if they vote for Democrats. President Trump criticized Jewish Americans who vote for Democrats, saying it shows either a total lack of knowledge or great disloyalty. Trump was speaking to the press in the Oval Office about the 2 Democratic congresswomen barred from entering Israel over their involvement in the movement to end international support for the country because of its policies towards Palestinians. And so you're getting pushback against that. Like J Street, a so-called liberal advocacy group for Israel, said in a statement, it is dangerous and shameful for President Trump to attack the large majority of American Jewish community as unintelligent and disloyal. All this stuff, it's all wind and waffle to try to divert attention from what is becoming so blatantly obvious, that Trump is owned by Israel and does whatever Israel wants. That's why the embassy, the American embassy, has been moved to Jerusalem with all its massive symbolic significance for Palestinians and so on. That's why there's no pushback against the blaze of building of Jewish-only settlements, not racist or anything, Jewish-only settlements in the illegally occupied West Bank. It's because Israel owns him. And then you've got the missile treaty with Russia. This whole cabal wants conflict between America, as I'm saying this for a very, very long time. They want conflict with America, China, and any allies of China and Russia, which would include Iran. Putin orders symmetrical response to US missile test and says Washington worked to breach the INF Treaty on Missile Production and Development. The Russian armed forces will scrutinize a recent cruise missile test conducted by the US after ditching the landmark INF Treaty and examine reciprocal measures. President Vladimir Putin has ordered the Defense Ministry and other bodies to, quote, study the level of threat posed by these US actions and take exhaustive measures to prepare a symmetrical response. Putin was speaking just days after the US military test-fired a ground version of Tomahawk cruise missiles that traveled around 310 miles, 500 kilometers, before hitting a mock target. The type of weapon fired from a Universal Mk-41 launch system in California was banned under the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty, which the US formally withdrew from on August the 2nd. What has been pointed out very accurately is that the test was clearly in the pipeline before the announcement that the treaty was being dropped. So the treaty was dropped on just a made-up excuse to allow what they were doing anyway to happen, which the treaty would banned. And what we're seeing now all around, including this trade war with China and what's happening in Hong Kong, is the movement towards creating a massive conflict, which this ultra-Zionist, Israel-owned project, the New American Century document, laid out in September 2000. And, the American government's strategy, again, the pattern is so obvious year after year, decade after decade, is to take legitimate, often legitimate, not always, but often legitimate concerns and demands of a target country's population and send in the agitators, the funding, and the people trained in the art of protest to whip it up and turn it into a, quote, people's revolution to bring down the target regime. They did this in Syria, they did this in Libya, they've tried to do it in Iran, did it in Ukraine, and they're trying to do it in China now. And I have absolutely no brief for the Chinese government. I think it's disgusting. And the way that it imposes its will on the country is grotesque. But it's just another form of control. They say capitalism is the opposition of communism. No, it's not. They're just two forms of the same means that the cabal hoard power in the hands of the few. In capitalism, they do it by hoarding the money. And in communism, they have a military underpinned structure of top-down control. And the outcome in both cases is that a tiny few dictate to everybody else. So they're just masks on the same cabal, they're just different form. But people are so naive that they think communism and capitalism are opposition. They're just different ways of controlling people by the same cabal. So I'm no supporter of China. But, if we're going to understand what's happening in the world, we've got to be dispassionate about it in the sense that if you have an emotional attachment to a government or a party or a ideology, then that's going to color everything you do, everything you think, and everything you perceive, because that's the filter you're going to filter all information through. If we're going to see what's really happening, you have to take a step back from that and look at outcomes, look at agendas. And then you'll see that regime change in China, again, was on the agenda of the Project for the New American Century, Israeli owned, in September 2000, and this is just another stepping stone towards that. The American support, hidden and otherwise, in Hong Kong, the undermining of the Iranian government, Israel bombing countries to keep the conflict bubbling. All these things are connected. They need to be seen as one pattern, one web, and then we might have a chance of seeing what's going on. And it just shows you, doesn't it, the mentality of those running the world, the mentality of people like Trump, that he came out and just thought he could even consider saying to Denmark, I want to buy Greenland.